Welcome to the Healthy Built Environment for Health Professionals training series. We are very excited today to be introducing Dr. Paul Hasselback to deliver a presentation titled Housing and Health. Welcome, Paul. I'll now pass the mic off to you.
Thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be able to provide this update and review of housing and health. Integral to what we do on a daily basis. I think if each of us was to take a look at our own careers, you're going to find that you've lived in multiple locations and multiple housing settings, and I went through the trouble and actually identified 22 different housing settings where I have lived for over 6 months, another dozen where it's between a couple of weeks and 6 months, and at least 3 times where I either was living in a tent or couch surfing or living in a back closet because there was no housing available. Now, I wouldn't necessarily consider myself any different than most, but I think it is a reflection, if we look back at our own lives, about how our housing situations change quickly and how over the next period of time we're going to talk a little bit about how those housing situations may affect our health. If we go to the outline here, and there, I apologize. What I'm going to be doing for the next little while is building on the Healthy Built Environment Toolkit, which is kind of our fundamental tool here in British Columbia for assessing the impacts and for improving our built environment. We'll take a look at some of the health issues, review the toolkit application, discuss the range of housing types of interventions that are available. Specific note about housing in First Nations and why we need to provide some emphasis in reducing some long-standing disparities. And what is the role of public health in housing and health, and perhaps a little bit about what more is needed. So if we look at the toolkit specifically, it actually talks about 4 major priority areas: increase accessibility to affordable housing, ensure quality housing, prioritize that we have housing available for those that are more vulnerable, such as homeless, low-income groups, elderly, those with disabilities, and to begin talking a little bit more about site and zoning for housing developments. If we look at the health issues themselves, for some people, housing is so integral to their health that it is an intervention unto itself, particularly for those with chronic persistent mental health issues who have become street-oriented or homeless. There's lots of good information on housing first relative to our ability to provide better therapeutic care for these individuals by providing appropriate housing. And likewise, when we look at some of the substance use addictions concerns, our current state of emergency in the province of British Columbia on substance use, we need to be looking not just at short-term solutions, but we need to be looking at some of those long-term solutions, such as appropriate housing. If we begin to look at some of the poorer housing examples, of which there are some photos, such poor housing can actually make people ill. I've certainly had experience with dilapidated structures, which are a physical risk for injury. We talk about radon, mold, poor stair designs leading to falls, environmental exposures to poor air quality and contaminants, all of which are manifestations of poor housing, can be avoided by better housing structures, but lead to actual illness themselves. We can also look at housing as an effort to improve the health of our communities. And healthier communities in general provide better environments for individuals to optimize their own health. So again, some of those characteristics of affordable, accessible, available, friendly, safe, and secure housing, all of which contribute to our personal well-being, as well as our community well-being. And in order to get there, we're looking at strategies that reflect on the diversity of options for ranges of income, and particularly supportive of housing for those that may be more challenged as a result of age, chronic illness, disability. But if we can go past even just trying to be a healthier community, we can begin talking about better living and better well-being. Some types of housing can actually stimulate social interaction or physical activity. So prime example that I use is a community that I did live in for a period of time that required that the balconies and porches were on the street side of the house. As a result of that, people actually sat out there and interacted with those walking on the street. It stimulated social interaction. Likewise, another community where backyards were essentially amalgamated together into green spaces that were collective at about every 2 to 3 blocks, so that no one was walking more than just a couple of minutes to get to a green space. We also know that good quality housing contributes to healthier communities, and the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation actually have a pretty good document that speaks to things like energy efficiency, resource efficiency, and some of the environmental responsibility which we would all like to be contributing to, all of which again contributes to our overall personal as well as community well-being. Focusing specifically on the toolkit and the application of the toolkit for those that are taking a look at community planning documents, one of the first major drivers is the access to affordable housing and ensuring that diversity of housing forms, that we are looking to be sure that we have housing that is tailored to income and not exceeding 30% of a person's annual income. That does lead to a reduction in overcrowding, but perhaps talks about increasing social interaction. So how can you balance those two particular components? We want to be sure that there is quality housing. Much of that is incorporated into the building code, but there are enhancements on top of that relative to ventilation, energy efficiency. Certainly the security and safety components are things that are more integral to the areas in and around the actual structure and not part of the building code. And we are looking for accessibility on an ongoing basis. We also want to be sure that those subgroups of the population which have unique housing needs are being looked at. So again, homelessness, certainly the build-up of tent cities is leading to really interesting discussions about what is an appropriate temporary or even semi-permanent home for those that are either economically or for whatever other reason may choose not to have a permanent structure. Those with medical needs, and certainly, as I mentioned already, we know that those with chronic persistent mental illness benefit greatly from a stable housing environment. We are also looking in the application of the toolkit to ensuring that you've got zoned appropriate residential environments, that they're reasonably close to retail environments, that stimulate those physical activity components, but are set back from major roadways because of poor air quality, outdoor air quality, noise, and there are some things that can be undertaken relative to radon reduction from a building code perspective for those areas, and we are well aware of certain hot spots across Canada where radon is more likely to occur. Enhancements to the building code that are incorporated in at the time of the build can reduce subsequent long-term problems. So I wanted to go back over some of this with a real focus in on the therapeutic values of housing. The Mental Health Commission of Canada which if you haven't taken a look at, is well worth reviewing the housing first, often called at home or chez soi. It was a focused, almost research study, demonstration that looked at the value of providing housing, period, without necessarily talking about the additional interventions. And various different sites across the country put a real focus on specific areas. Vancouver was included in that. And some of the comments that come forward, one in terms of reducing the homelessness populations. It is the easiest solution. It clearly came across in the Housing First initiative. We're also able to do the economic analysis that demonstrated the sound investment, and that when those supports are incorporated into appropriate housing, semi-collective housing environments, that you get positive outcomes that are well above what you would normally provide just in the sort of sheltering environment, so that enhancements can be made to the actual physical housing structures. Many of us are faced with, on a daily basis, hearing about dilapidated buildings or buildings that are have become a health problem for their inhabitants. I do flag that in British Columbia there really is a lack of a concerted effort, though many communities undertake some form of joint activity between fire, perhaps the bylaw enforcement folks, health, that can collectively go into a home, look at doing a joint inspection. Each of those regulators may be able to comment on particular components of that housing situation in terms of a requirement of enhancements or remediation. The collective effort of coming together then makes it easier for the community as a whole to address some of these poor housing settings. That's quite a problematic process. There is not a great deal of support by some communities. Certainly not even all environmental health programs are supportive of actually getting involved in the housing area. So in BC, we often fall back on residential tenancy legislation, and the general emphasis being on the inhabitant or the rentor or leaseor or even the owner to resolve the problem. Whereas if we were to look to Alberta, Alberta has housing regulations in place. There are clear, which are part of the public health legislation, there are clear approaches where a site, more often leased properties, can be declared as unfit for human habitation. It's not part of an eviction or asking people to move out, but once a premises have been vacated, it becomes an onus to actually bring anybody in when there's a declaration when it's unfit for human habitation. So the owner of the property then has a responsibility to mitigate those damages, and as a result the housing stock continues to improve rather than deteriorate. It would be really helpful to have some of that brought into other provincial settings as well. We do have particular specific approaches to where grow-ups and chemical labs have been found in previous home settings, but again, that actually is more uncommon and doesn't give us all the powers that we really need to ensure that our housing stock is continuing to improve. If we look at census information, we do find out that there's a significant proportion in that 15 to sometimes as high as 30% range of housing stock that is currently being used that is in need of remediation or enhancement. And in some communities, the aging of that housing stock is such that interventions probably are even more urgent with the lack of tools to do so. Just moving on here, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the midterm solutions to housing strategies, and a lot of this actually comes to thinking ahead. The development in many communities across the province and outside the province as well on homelessness strategies, which is really about not so much homelessness, but about providing homes. It is a focus on trying to reduce street-oriented individuals and their lifestyles, whether we're talking about semi-permanent structures like tents or whether we're talking about individuals who truly are sleeping on the streets. Developing that homelessness strategy has resulted in improved housing options available in many communities. New Westminster provides us with what I think is one of the better practices in the province at this point in time. It is a clear incorporation into the official community plan of the priority of housing. They are challenged by limited space, by an aging population when they would like to be able to attract a younger population. And so written into the official community plan are incentives to the private market to increase the range of housing options with a particular focus on family-friendly housing. It is how a community can look at what its community needs are, apply the existing planning tools to actually see the sort of changes that they want. And if you haven't had an opportunity to walk around in the downtown part of New Westminster, I think you'd probably see that it's something I encourage everyone to do, but you also begin to see that it's become very family friendly, lots of nice environments to live in, and a real attraction for families. And they are seeing that shift in demographic to the broader diversity of individuals living in the community. Part of this, again, speaks to the long-term planning that we need to be incorporating into all our official community plans, housing needs. Example in terms of a comment from the Comox Valley Regional District to ensure that they are looking at that range of housing options in rural settings. Certainly other places have been looking at legalization of secondary suites, not just for family members, but to just increase that diversity of options, and sometimes in a very hot housing market as an opportunity for owners to be able to reduce their personal costs and actually afford housing more by leasing out portions of the building, whether they're secondary suites or units. And certainly the recognition that home is the best place for individuals to stay as long as possible, so aging in place rather than relocating individuals at a fragile time in their older years or during the as a result of medical conditions into a setting which is less desirable. So what can we do to encourage that? One of our major tools from a long-term perspective is the Canadian Building Code. It is something that is an expectation in most locations, and I stress most locations, but only applies to new builds, and some application to substantively remodeled or redeveloped buildings as well. Its fundamental foundations come from fire prevention, structural safety. It has moved more into things, including more recently the expectations on new stair design as a requirement to help reduce falls, and this has to do with the length of the step and the more typical older housing with 6-inch stairs is far less safe than if we were looking at 10-inch stairs. And as has been a theme that I've raised a couple of times, there are ways of protecting against radon at the time of the build. In essence, it's a two-step foundation. When the cement goes down into the basement, you put down half of it, you cover it with a plastic sheet so that you're actually sealing at that point, and then you complete the fill of the concrete. Because it takes longer, it has been highly resisted in terms of its incorporation into the building code. It may not be necessary in all settings, but certainly something that can also be enhanced at a local setting in those hotspot areas. The Canadian Building Code, however, was not applied to many of our First Nations housing initiatives, if we're going back a few decades, and as a result we have inferior housing stock, not almost by design, relative to our First Nations communities. Many of those housing stock are actually owned by First Nation housing departments. It's compounded by overcrowding. It's compounded by the lack of investment in terms of improvements, let alone new builds. And so we have real challenges in our First Nations, and just the encouragement of a recognition that in rebuilding nations, we actually need to start with our infrastructure and be sure that we have a solid infrastructure for First Nations communities. Part of that will be looking at this component of housing stock that needs to be improved. Just a little side note here about, in some settings, we have certificate of possession where First Nations have actually sold particular units to members, and those housing departments now don't have responsibility for the units, so that in some settings housing departments can come in and help, others don't. There aren't necessarily the same bylaws in place that would require maintenance, upkeep, and general appearance of houses as you might find in other local government settings, so that application of some of those local government tools that we use for improving our housing stock would be ideally incorporated into some of our First Nations communities. I have not seen a lot of good best practices yet in terms of First Nations. There are a few First Nations, though, that I'm aware of and have worked with, where this has been a focus and has been highly successful. So what does public health have to do? I start by flagging of the toolkit realms. The housing component is probably the least well developed. That's not a criticism so much as a statement, and that it provides lots of opportunity for us to understand more about what can we intervene on and how is that going to make a difference for public health. So those that are listening that have an interest in pursuing perhaps a research agenda, wide open field here for longer term studies that really do focus in on what is that interrelationship between housing and health. As much as we can talk about the short-term negative consequences, we need more about how we enhance the well-being of individuals by good housing settings. We certainly have a role in public health in what I call the traditional developmental review. Those traditional reviews do tend to focus strictly on compliance, usually about water and sewage, sometimes about safety. With time, we started seeing this broader approach to addressing things as flagged in terms of accessibility, friendliness, the social engagement, the healthier lifestyles, and in particular the question of affordability. Checklists are beginning to be developed about sort of saying, have you looked at this? Less so about what does it exactly look like when we're applying those checklists on the ground. We have a role to play to advocate for the building code, and there are some individuals in Canada that have spent a fair bit of their careers focused in on particular components and working with the Canada Building Code structures, sitting on the review committees that are of public health professionals, so that the building code actually does incorporate in what are safer, healthier environments. I think that we need a few more that need to be begin to look at how they can provide those contributions. We have a role to play in encouraging housing strategies, not just homelessness, but the broader approach to ensuring that we have that diversity of housing. And we certainly have a role to advocate for improvements for the housing stock for our First Nations. In BC, I think that we should be advocating for a stronger role for remediation, whether that's undertaken by public health or another regulatory entity could remain unclear, but the reality is at the moment that putting the onus strictly on the leaseor in terms of going back at the landlord to try to get improvements probably hasn't worked and isn't appropriate. There's lots of room, as I mentioned, in terms of research to support the toolkit. The toolkit is evidence-based, and we're lacking a lot of evidence. So please, researchers, begin to look at things like social connectedness. What does it look like when we actually intervene in some of these less than desirable housing situations? And how does that lead to better well-being? What are those measures? So in concluding, the number one statement that there is a strong relationship between housing and illness. We're developing our understanding about housing as an intervention for health and improvement of health. We have a poor understanding as that foundation for its actual well-being or thriving of wellness. Our current focus in public health tends to be on the development and the planning component. And again, just a plea for addressing needs of remediation and First Nations. And finally, for those that do have questions, please feel free to contact me at the email address or call into my office. Happy to have a conversation in respect to how we can further improve the well-being of our populations by addressing their housing needs, someplace that we do spend almost 2/3 of our life in. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.